So what happens when a police department's promises on civil rights don't actually line up with what they're doing? Today we are digging into a really critical audit that found a major gap between policy and practice, a gap that could be putting the safety and rights of an entire community at risk.
First, to really get what's at stake here, you have to understand the place. We're talking about Monroe County, New York. It's home to the National Technical Institute for the Deaf, which means it has one of the largest populations of deaf and hard-of-hearing people per capita in the entire United States. Now, that's not just some interesting fact. It's the fundamental reality of policing in this area. Encounters with deaf individuals aren't some rare what-if scenario. They're a foreseeable, everyday thing.
And that leads to the big question, right? Are the police actually ready to meet their legal duty, their ethical obligation to communicate effectively with this community? A recent audit went looking for the answer.
The investigation kicked off exactly where you'd expect, with the department's own rules. And, on the surface, it looked like the Greece Police Department had a pretty solid plan.
It's a thing called Policy 333. This is the official document, the rule book, that's supposed to make sure communication with people with disabilities meets the standards of the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA. It's the department saying, yes, we are committed to upholding the law.
And this policy is really specific. It requires an ADA coordinator to be appointed. It mandates specific training for officers. It demands that every single one of those training records be kept. And it puts a deputy chief in charge of making sure it all happens. These are not suggestions. These are black and white requirements from their own rulebook.
Okay, so the policy is there, on paper. The auditors then asked a really simple but incredibly powerful question: where's the proof? To get that proof, the audit used New York's Freedom of Information Law, which most people just call FOIA. This is the law that lets the public ask for government documents. So the auditors filed requests for the exact records that Policy 333 said the department had to create and keep.
And the answer they got back? Well, it's pretty stunning. On the left, you see what the policy clearly requires. And on the right, the town of Greece's official response: for every single item, no responsive records exist. No proof of an ADA coordinator, no training materials, no records of who was trained or when they were trained, just nothing.
And, just getting this nothing to see here answer was a whole saga. It definitely raised some serious red flags about transparency. After the first request, the town tried to deny the records. Then they gave this vague, rolling extension with no actual deadline, before finally, over 2 months later, admitting the documents just weren't there.
So now, armed with the town's own admission that no records exist, the auditors did the next logical thing. They filed a formal complaint right back to the police department.
The complaint was really straightforward. It basically said, hey, your policy says these records have to exist, but the town, which is supposed to have them, says they don't. What's going on here?
And the response from the department's own Deputy Chief of Internal Standards is, wow. The key phrase is right there in black and white. The policy discrepancy you brought to our attention is being addressed. That is a direct, written admission from inside the department that there's a gap between what their policy says and what they actually do.
But here's where it gets kinda perplexing. Even though they acknowledge this failure to implement a mandatory policy, a failure at the command level, the department decided this was not a personnel complaint, and they gave no reason why. So it leaves this huge question just hanging there. Who, if anyone, is accountable?
This confirmation of a policy discrepancy wasn't the end of it. In fact, it was the launching pad for the audit's most significant action, formally putting the town's top leadership on notice.
A notice of population level ADA communication risk was sent right to the town supervisor and the police chief. This wasn't about a single incident anymore. It was a formal warning that the entire system for communication access seems to be broken, creating a massive risk to the public and a huge liability for the town.
The notice laid out 3 specific kinds of risk. First, operational risk. For a deaf person, that means your safety in an encounter depends entirely on the goodwill or knowledge of one officer, not on a reliable system. Second, governance risk. That points to a failure of oversight at the very top. The town isn't just out of compliance with its own rules, but with federal law. And finally, auditability risk. Look, if something goes wrong, the department has no records, no paper trail to prove it did what it was supposed to do. That's a massive legal and financial liability waiting to happen.
And this is about so much more than missing paperwork. What this audit really uncovered is a failure with deep, real-world consequences for people's civil rights and for public trust. A policy that isn't actually being followed means that during a traffic stop, or a crisis at home, or a medical emergency,
A deaf person's ability to understand what's happening and to make themselves understood is basically left to chance. Their rights aren't guaranteed by a system, they're just a matter of luck.
Because we have to be really clear about this. Under the Americans with Disabilities Act, effective communication is not an optional courtesy. It is a mandatory, legally enforceable civil rights obligation for any police department. It's the law, period.
As the source material puts it so well, this isn't some special favor you grant when you feel like it. It's a fundamental piece of how our government is supposed to work for everybody, every single day.
So this audit found a system that was documented in a policy but was basically absent in practice. It leaves us all with a final, really critical question. When a gap like this exists, a gap that affects people's safety and their fundamental rights, who is ultimately responsible for closing it?